Alright, I don't know about you, but I feel kind of bad about ragging on playing out of position so much lately. I mean, put yourself in the shoes of poor old out of position. Everybody talks about how cool his in position brother is and how much they've heard about him, and everyone always leaves poor out of position off of the list when they send out invitations to parties. And to make it even worse, out of position has terrible luck with chicks. But you can't really blame the chicks, because, after all, no chick wants to be with someone who's playing out of position in the bedroom, right? But you know what? I'm sick of all the negative publicity that playing out of position gets, man. Every PLO book or training video constantly reminds us of how cool being in position is. So does that mean we can only play monsters when we're out of position? Are we honestly supposed to just surrender whenever we find ourselves facing a raise when we're out of position? There's got to be a solution to this. Fortunately for us, there is, and it's called the donk bet, which is defined as leading with a bet on the flop without the pre-flop initiative. But the reasons for why donk betting is cool go beyond the fact that our awkward buddy out of position can go to parties now and actually have a shot at getting laid. So let's check out the next slide and talk about why donking is the nuts. Okay, in all seriousness though, there's really three main reasons why donk betting is basically the nuts in PLO. The first, and probably the most important reason to become a donk betting master, is because it helps neutralize the positional advantage. See, in No Limit, you can get away with rarely donking because of the difference in equity distribution between the two games. To put it in layman's terms, there's many more way ahead or way behind situations on the flop in No Limit than there are in PLO, which means that check calling out of position can be the best line to take if you have, say, ace 10 on a king 10x board. But in PLO, falling into the habit of check calling out of position all the time is going to put you in a lot of tough spots on later streets, since the equities are so much closer together post flop. And if you recall in Lesson 5, we established the 5 main reasons why position is valuable in PLO, which are extracting value, bluffing, pot control, equity realization, and getting to showdown. In one way or another, donk betting neutralizes each of these advantages that the player in position has on us. Now, anyone that's been my student before will tell you that I'm a huge advocate of playing heads up, especially when you're learning how to play a new game. I could probably do an entirely separate product for why I believe so strongly in this, but for now I just want to point out that if you do have aspirations of playing heads up in the near future, or at any time for that matter, you will get absolutely demolished if you don't learn how to donk bet correctly. Good players will destroy you if you don't find a way to minimize the damage of playing out of position half the time. And then even against fish, you're losing a ton of value if you're only relying on gaining profit when you're in position. To put it simply, the guys that really crush the games win a very high percentage of the heads up pots they find themselves in. And there's a reason that the best players in the world prefer to play heads up. Six max can be very limiting if you're a huge sicko because of all of the multi-way action. Second, donk betting is very deceptive when used correctly. And from my experience, there's very few players that know how to correctly adjust to a balanced donk betting strategy. Now, in earlier lessons, we established that when constructing our lines post-flop, one of our primary goals is to choose the line that represents the widest range of hands. Donk betting complements this strategy perfect because, again, if you remember from earlier lessons, we established that the situation we want to avoid the most in PLO is check calling out of position with medium strength hands and draws. This is a great concept, but the fact of the matter is that we won't always have the luxury of only having the nuts or air when we're out of position. It's just not that easy. Sometimes you'll be forced to play a medium strength range out of position, and donk betting with these ranges on a variety of boards is a great line to take in these scenarios. Don't worry, you'll see what I mean in the hand histories following the lesson. Donk betting also gives us a lot of information about the ranges of our opponents, because like we mentioned earlier, most players like to protect their strong hands, especially on dry boards, which means that depending on the board texture, you can narrow their ranges down, while at the same time your range remains very undefined. Last, controlling the dead money by having the right to first bluff is another benefit received from donk betting. As you'll see in the next few slides, on the right boards against certain player types, just being the first one to bet is enough to take down the pot. Additionally, donk betting allows you to take it upon yourself to build up a sizable pot to scoop later on, rather than relying on the player in position to c-bet it for you. By now you're probably thinking, okay, it looks like donk betting in PLO is really useful, but I know I can't donk bet every time I'm heads up out of position, so what kind of flop scenarios should I be considering a donk bet on? Good question, my friend, and I'm glad you were kind enough to bring that up, because luckily for you, we're going to spend the next couple of slides looking at 4 different scenarios where you should definitely take into consideration using a donk bet. The first one is when you hold a strong hand or draw and your opponent is unlikely to bet. So using our example on the slide here, let's say we have top set on a king-queen-8 two-tone board. This is a good time to consider leading out with a bet, because as we've mentioned before, the one thing you definitely want to avoid is giving free cards to a field of players with hands they won't bet themselves, especially on the boards where they likely have a lot of draws that can beat you. In scenarios like this, a lot of beginning players reason that they don't want a donk bet because they're afraid that they'll look too strong and that the other player will just fold. Look, don't worry about looking strong. Just bet and let the rest of the hand take care of itself. On boards like this, there's a ton of different hands that will definitely call you, so simply make it easy on yourself and get to work on building a pot with the best hand. And this concept is important enough that I made a quick concept to remind you that whenever you're facing passive opponents holding a strong hand, the goal is to start building the pot early. Pots in PLO grow geometrically, so if you turn your big hands into only 2-street betting games, you're costing yourself a ton of value in the long run. Next, like we mentioned last slide, a good spot to donk bet is when you want to define your opponent's range, because many times it forces your opponents to play straightforwardly against you. Using the example we have here, let's say we hold ace-ace 10-4 single-suited on king-jack-7 rainbow. Leading out is a good option because if we get raised, it's an easy fold, and if he calls us, his hand is basically turned face up. Most opponents don't have the discipline to smooth call with top 2 or a set on boards like this, so when they only call you in position, it's mostly going to be a range of top pair and side cards, bottom 2, or some other type of weakish straight draw. And besides, things aren't so bleak for us anyway. We have a gut shot and a backdoor flush draw to go along with our overpair. Plus, even if he outright folds, that's a fine result for us, because there's a lot of random hands that have equity hovering around 30% that'll fold to a donk bet. Another situation where donking is a good option is when you want to be deceptive when holding a monster. Now, it's important to point out that donking out when you flop a boat like we have in the example here probably isn't the best option against an unknown opponent, because they'll always bet trips, some overpairs, and probably their air as well. So you don't want to kill your action by leading out on the flop. But in an aggressive dynamic against a player you have some history against, donking can be a great way to induce floats and bluff raises. Last, if you think you have fold equity and your opponent is unlikely to c-bet, then leading out on paired and monotone boards is fine too. Remember that passive players won't c-bet boards nearly as much, so the easiest way to both prevent them from realizing their equity and to pick up the pot is to lead out on the boards that they don't hit very often. Another good reason for donking instead of check raising boards like this is because it's cheaper than check raising. One last thing I want to mention is that if you don't have any fold equity, then leading out is a bad idea. If you're playing a passive calling station that just simply never folds, then don't lead out unless you plan on betting 3 streets. As we've said before, building pots with no hand and no fold equity will destroy your win rate. The last several slides have been devoted to showing you a couple of strategies you can use to fight back when you're out of position. Understanding the theoretical reasoning for why they work makes sense on the surface, but the key to printing money from donking and check raising comes from knowing the right time to use each one. Now, you'll get a better feel for how to apply this stuff at the tables once you check out the hand histories following the slides. But for now, just realize that the decision of whether to donk or check raise is primarily based on player type, hand strength, and the capitalization of dead money. But before we go any further, there's 2 very important definitions to hammer out. So let's do it. Last slide, we established that the decision of whether or not to check raise depends greatly on the capitalization of dead money. But something that a lot of players don't understand is that all dead money isn't created equal. More specifically, to give yourself the best chance to capitalize on dead money, you need to be conscious of exactly where the dead money came from in the first place. It's important to point out that the following definitions were taken from Andrew Seidman, aka Beluga Whale's ebook on No Limit Hold'em titled Easy Game, which is a really good read, so if you haven't checked it out, you definitely should. Anyways, there's 2 types of dead money. Passive dead money occurs when a player calls a bet on one street with the intention of folding to another, while aggressive dead money is defined as an aggressive act after which the aggressor will fold his hand to further action. Now, the biggest difference between aggressive dead money and passive dead money is that aggressive dead money is created by an attempt to win the pot, while passive dead money can't possibly win the pot. Put more simply, passive dead money is created by passive players, and aggressive dead money is created by aggressive players. Capitalizing on passive dead money is a key element for beating the lower stakes, and it's one of the reasons that hyper-aggressive styles can work pretty well at the lower levels. The majority of players can't hand read very well, and they tend to play passively when facing aggression. But I can't tell you how many times I've seen a player destroy the lower levels using this style, and then get crushed when they try it at the higher limits. As you move up, the players can hand read better, which means they won't let you get away with nearly as much as the players in the micros. Instead of check calling the flop and then folding to a bet on the turn, players at the higher levels will check call the flop just to check raise the turn in order to win more dead money. Understanding these definitions is easy enough, but how does all of this relate to check raising? Well, all it means is that you need to pay attention to opponent tendencies. If they're going to fire a c-bet, then check raising is a much better option, because they're creating aggressive dead money for you to take away by re-bluffing them. But passive players generally don't bet their air, which means that to take down the pot, you need to donk bet to pick it up instead. Don't worry, you'll get a better feel for all of this when we go over the hand histories after the lesson.
Hey, what's going on, guys? Casino Crime here. Now, if you like this video and you want more, then go ahead and click the subscribe button below right now. And if you want to join me for more of my 6 max success secrets and free video tutorials, just click the link to the right. See you inside the trainings. Good luck.